give you my thoughts on Budget 2024, which was announced around lunchtime today. Can you relate to the difference between a million, a billion, a trillion? Even if you can't, or for those who can't, I give two reference points. To run this little country of ours, it takes 100 billion euro a year to run the country. So the government, in principle, raises taxes to the tune of 100 billion and spends 100 billion. That amounts to, given that there's 5 million of us, so in simple maths, that amounts to 20,000 euro per man, woman and child. That's the level of tax that's raised and spent on our behalf. And that 100 billion is spent, but 60% of it is spent on social welfare, on health and education, in that order. And if they just took in 100 billion and put out 100 billion, that would be what we call a balanced budget. And our little country is so fortunate at the moment that there's so much taxes flowing in that the governments are having no challenge I consider this budget kind of splash the cash. They have no bother spending money, keep everyone happy, and yet have a surplus. So they're taking in about, I said 100, they're actually taking in about 8 billion more than they're putting out. The other reference point I'd give you is that, so let's say that's what we might call the income side of it, but if we look at simply at the balance sheet side of it, before the government starts in any year, they have debt, we have debt of about 220 billion, back to billions again. 220 billion amounts to a little over 40,000 per man, woman and child. So you and I and all our relatives, men, women, children, all have, in addition to the overdraft they know about, they all have an overdraft of about 40,000 each. You will hear today about 2 new funds, so 2 new pots of money he's setting up. And it's the piece where he says, well, I'm being very prudent, I'm taking in more money than I'm putting out, so we're going to put it into 2 new pots. And he called them a Future Ireland Fund and an infrastructure stroke climate stroke nature fund. The second one, I'd say shorthand, an Eamon Ryan fund. Early summer, the minister explained that these surpluses are coming in, like we're taking in money at such a rate. These surpluses are building, and he says, give it a few years, we'd have 65 billion in what I think he termed and others termed a sovereign fund. But I'd love to correct them on that. And I was fortunate enough to be in Norway for a few days in August. Things that interested me, they are cashless. You can only spend money with a tap, no cash. Another thing I couldn't help notice, if I got a taxi, taxis are all EVs, but upmarket EVs. So like you're going around in a Tesla or an upmarket Mercedes, cars that would cost 100 grand here. And they cost a lot less there. And that got me to thinking, why did they cost a lot less? Because Norway is a really fortunate country. We're a fortunate country economically. That's a really fortunate country because they pumped a lot of oil and they haven't spent the money foolishly. They've built it up. And they have a sovereign wealth fund. So when our guys started talking about that we will have a sovereign wealth fund in a few months or a few years' time, I'm saying, guys, that's nonsense, because we're starting with big debt. Norway has no debt. So the average person there has a piggy bank that they kind of don't know about, worth 200,000. The average guy here has an overdraft of 40,000 that they don't know about. Okay. I should give my impressions of the budget. And I was saying to you, like, I'm interested in the politics and the economics and the sociology, never mind the taxation pieces. What I see is that, at a political level, they see Sinn Féin kind of knocking on the door or knocking on the gates. And in a sense, we're getting the kind of budget that they're trying to keep Sinn Féin away from the gates. Like spending money and don't disappoint anybody, splash the cash. Almost that you kind of getting a Sinn Féin budget without Sinn Féin being in power. Have all this money and they are splashing it out. They don't want to offend any voter, so anyone on social welfare is going to get a minimum of €12. Anyone paying income tax is going to get, like €12 per week. Anyone paying income tax will be better off by to the tune of 850 a year, I'd say. And then there's going to be reduced childcare fees, and there's going to be reduced college fees, and there's going to be free books for some of the time in secondary school, and there's it's all goodies. That there's going to be 3 credits against your electricity bill to the tune of €450. And I don't want to sound like a Scrooge here, but I have a slight distaste for it. I think, like, our country is fortunate. We're going through good times. The good times won't last forever. Inevitably, they won't. And when this time is past, I think we will regret that we didn't do bigger things, rather than a few bob to people on their ESB bill and a few bob here, that we didn't do bigger things. I think there's an absence of big thinking. It kind of embarrasses me that you fly back into Dublin and there's no Heathrow Express. There's like a stranger comes into Dublin, how do they get into the city? And I'd love to see money being spent on big things, go big on renewable energy, go big on methods of storing renewable energy. I think there's an absence of big thinking, and I suppose accountants are not the kind of guys you'd ask for big thinking, but I think they need to set up a department of what should we do, because it's the first time in 100 years since the state was established that we can think big rather than just getting by and say, we have this money coming in, what should we be doing with it? And then a lot of this money is given out indiscriminately. There'll be people who need it badly, there'll be people who need it, but there's a bunch of people in there who won't need,
who won't notice it.
Won't even notice it. Okay. I'd also be critical that the ECB and central banks across the Western world they're driving up interest rates to fight inflation. And what our government is doing is the very opposite. They're just throwing money into the system, which is having the exact opposite effect. Now, if the big countries, if France and Germany behave like that, then the ECB would have to give up the fight. They'd have to give up the fight against inflation. So we're kind of only being allowed to do it because we're small and peripheral, and we can afford to. So in the area of income tax, I think I touched on it already. There are changes to tax band, credits, and USC. The net effect will be around an improvement in take home of about 800, 850 per annum, I would say. I think it was last year they introduced a rent credit of €500 per year. That's been up to 750. I stumbled on something only in recent days. I'd say through statistics, the government knows that there are so many people renting, but only about half that many claimed that credit in the last year. There's a new mortgage interest credit. Like, let's say your mortgage was 300,000, and let's say interest rates jumped by 3 percentage points since last year. Let's say from 2% to 5%, jumped by 3. So that's 3 threes. That's an increased cost to the mortgage holder of 9,000. So the government will give that person, by way of a credit, 20% of that, which would be €1,800. But I'm going to correct myself by saying there's a cap of 1,250. So no matter how big your mortgage, no matter how big the interest rate jump, the most you're going to gain is €1,250. But I'd say people will be glad of it. There's a special tax credit for landlords. So a landlord will, he or she will have a tax credit of €600 this coming year, 800 the following year, 1,000 the following year, and afterwards. So it's being introduced as a 4-year scheme. Okay. He's being incentivized not to get out of the game, so that if he pockets that 600 and the 800 and the 1,000, but if he sells the house after 3 years, it's clawed back. I'll talk for a moment about the stuff, the little bits I see in there for business. There's a I'll call it a rates rebate. I understand by it that if you're in business and your rates bill is, let's say, €6,000, you will, next year it'll only be €3,000. That you'll get 50% of your rates relieved. Again, grand, but do they need it? Not so sure. It's my experience that business, business is having a good time. Last year, this year, expectations next year. Like even though costs have gone up, business in the SME sector is good. The biggest issue is around staff. Like all my clients, the constant discussion from my clients is, business is good, can get all the work I want or sell all the goods I want. Price isn't a huge issue. Where can I get the people to do it? A couple of other bits in terms of supporting new ventures. We already have and have had for a number of years what we call the EIIS, the Employment Investment Incentive Scheme, and it's been there for years. It's the, let's say, where most typically I see it used, like let's say someone's starting up a new whiskey venture, a new distilling venture in South Kildare or wherever, and they'll get investors in, and it's carries some risk with it, and those investors will get tax relief on it. It's being expanded. So there was up to this a 250,000 limit on the amount of investment one might make. Now that's jumped to 500,000. Something else, it will apply now to bigger companies. Let's say it'll be typically applied more to Merck across the road than it will apply to my clients in the space of the R&D credit. R&D credits were at the rate of 25% of your spend. That's going to 30% of your spend. And I can see a mathematical link between the 12.5% tax rate going to 15%, because that's our little country is being arm twisted into lifting the 12.5% rate to 15%. The budget will allow for it, and it will be implemented when the OECD and Joe Biden can get their act together and make this happen. And it seems to me that 30% R&D credit is in line with the lifted 15% rate. A couple of changes in the area of capital gains tax. The way I would summarize it, I would say age 70 is the new 65. So if I have a client who's selling a business, we say retiring, we call it retiring, it's client selling a business or passing that business on to his family, his or her family. The tax gives a strong incentive to get the business done before age 66, so 65 or younger. And that 65 has been moved up to 70. So people can now delay that sale of the business or that transfer to the next generation by a further 5 years. That's good news. There's a sting in the tail though, because I'll give you an example. Well, no, I'll try and explain the principle first. A transfer of a business within your family. If I have a very valuable business, no matter, think 100 million, don't matter, a very valuable business, I can transfer that business to my children without any concern to me about capital gains tax. Now, they may have tax on, they may have gift tax on getting, but I have no capital gains tax on giving, irrespective of the value, so long as I do it before I hit age 66, which will now be 70. But the sting in the tail is that the fact that there was no limit, irrespective of the value, now they're bringing in a cap there, so I can transfer a business with a value up to 10 million. Now that's still a comfortable number, but above that will be taxed, and that will have serious repercussions for some people in what you and I might call big business. And it's an area where we do a good lot of work. We fancily call it succession planning, but that space when people get to that age where, what's the next natural move? Do I sell the business and retire? Am I passing it on to my family? What are the tax implications? There's a good lot involved there. So there are changes in there that will impact some people. One other little thing I see, there's there's a relief in that space. We call it entrepreneurial relief. So there's a special 10% capital gains tax rate on the first million of gain for the sale of family businesses. It's been there since 2016, and the only thing I saw about it in today's speech was that the minister is going to call upon his officials to examine it to see if it can be refocused. That can only mean one thing: it means a narrowing down. Right now, it has broader application than they intended when they brought it in 2016. In the area of VAT, I see no significant change. I see a tiny change that as you're coming into business, if I'm selling goods, and as things stand and have stood for a few years, if I'm selling goods and I anticipate that I'll sell more than 75,000 in a year, I have to register for VAT. If I'm selling services like you and I, that threshold is 37,500. Those thresholds have been bumped marginally up to 80,000 and 40 respectively, so little change. Another small little one, although it will affect some of our not-for-profit clients. There's a pot of money that gets shared, a small pot of money that gets shared out among charities. So if a charity puts its hand up and says, well, we paid, we were out of pocket for VAT to the tune of 20,000 on our printing and stationery and computers and ESB, they put in an application to government, and a certain pot gets shared out pro rata across the country. Tiny pot of only 5 million across the entire country. So is there anything? No. Nothing else I want to touch on in terms of the detail. I have a sense a little bit negative about some of the principles or this overspending of money, and I mean I should be the opposite. We should be rejoicing. We should be rejoicing in where our little country is, that it can afford to do all these things and yet put some money by for the future.
Okay, so your overall opinion, Tony, a good budget. Will people be happy with this budget?
Oh, people will be happy. Oh yes, and there'll be. Watch the opinion polls. There will be a favourable bounce towards government, but people will like it.